The village of Asankare, nestled along the slow-moving Pra River in Ghana's Ashanti region, the air smelled of red earth and smoked fish. Kofi Asamoah woke before dawn, as he always did, to the sound of roosters crowing and the faint clatter of his mother's mortar-pounding yam in the courtyard. At 24, Kofi was the eldest son, broad-shouldered from years of carrying looms and dyed thread. His hands stained indigo from weaving kente cloth. His family, his widowed mother, Edwoa, and his younger sisters, Efia and Akosua, depended on him since his father's death 5 years ago, struck down by a fever that swept the village like a thief in the night. Asankare was a place of mud brick homes with thatched roofs, where the baobab tree in the center square stood as a silent witness to births, deaths, and disputes. Kofi's workshop was a lean-to beside their house, its walls lined with rolls of bright fabric, gold for royalty, green for growth, red for sacrifice. Kente wasn't just cloth here. It was a story, a prayer, a currency. He wove patterns his father had taught him, like nkinkim, the zigzag of life's twists, or obi enkie obi kwan musi, a reminder that no one's path is free of trouble. Each strip took days, his fingers threading the loom with a rhythm like a drummer's beat. But the market in Kumasi paid little these days. Traders haggled hard, and Kofi's earnings barely bought maize and palm oil for this season, though, was worse. A drought had parched the fields beyond Asankare, turning the yam mounds to dust and the river to a sluggish trickle. Edwoa's garden withered, and Efia, at 16, had stopped going to school to help fetch water from a distant well. Akosua, only 12, coughed from the dry air, her small frame growing thinner. Kofi felt the weight of it all, his mother's tired eyes, his sister's hunger, pressing on his chest like a stone. He wove faster, slept less, but the coins in the tin under his mat dwindled. One humid afternoon, as Kofi sat under the lean-to threading a new strip, a shadow fell across his work. He looked up to see Nana Ya Boteng, a trader from Kumasi, stepping down from a dusty Toyota with a swagger that matched his embroidered agbada. Nana Ya was a big man in every sense, broad, loud, and rich, known for buying kente in bulk and selling it to foreigners for triple the price. Behind him trailed his daughter, Abina, a tall girl of 20 with sharp eyes and a bored twist to her lips, fanning herself with a silk scarf. "Kofi Asamoah!" Nana Ya boomed, his voice carrying over the chatter of goats. "Your cloth is the finest in Asankare. I've seen it in the market. Kings would wear it." Kofi stood, wiping his hands on his shorts. "Thank you, Nana, but the market pays poorly these days." Nana Ya grinned, showing gold-capped teeth. "That's why I'm here. I have a proposition." He gestured to Abena, who barely glanced at Kofi. "My daughter needs a husband. Marry her, and I'll clear your family's debts. Every cedi owed to the grain seller, the water carrier, even that old loan from the chief's son. You'll weave for me, and I'll make you a rich man." Kofi's stomach tightened. He knew of Abena, spoiled, sharp-tongued, raised in Kumasi with a taste for city life. He'd heard she once slapped a market boy for spilling her soda, but he also knew his family's debts. 200 cedis to the grain seller, 50 to the water carrier, and 300 to Kwadwo, the chief's son, who'd lent them money for his father's funeral. It was a noose around their necks. Still, his heart sank. He dreamed of marrying Serwea, the quiet girl who sold groundnuts by the river, her laughter soft as a breeze. They'd known each other since childhood, sharing mangoes under the baobab, and he'd planned to court her properly when the rains returned. "I'll think on it," Kofi said, his voice steady despite the churn in his gut. Nana Ya clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. I'll return in 3 days for your answer. Don't let pride starve your family, eh?" He strode back to his car, Abena trailing behind, her scarf fluttering like a taunt. That night, Kofi sat with his mother by the fire as she stirred a thin pot of groundnut soup. Efia and Akosua slept on mats nearby, their breathing shallow. Adwoa's face, lined from years of sun and worry, turned to him. "What did Nana Yaw want?" Kofi told her, his words slow. When he finished, Adwoa stared into the flames. "Kofi, we can't go on like this. The grain seller won't sell to us anymore. Akosua needs medicine. This could save us." "But Mommy," he said, using the Twi word for mother, "I don't love Abina. I barely know her." "Love grows," Adwoa replied, her voice firm. "Your father and I didn't love each other when we married. It came with time, with respect. You're the man of this house now. Think of your sisters." Kofi lay awake that night, the thatch above him rustling with night insects. He thought of Sirwa's smile, the way she'd once tied a strip of his kente around her wrist, calling it beautiful. He thought of Akosua's cough, Efia's calloused feet. By morning, his decision sat heavy but clear. 3 days later, Nana Yaw returned, this time with a goatskin pouch of cities and a contract for Kofi to sign. The village gathered under the baobab, curious and whispering, as Kofi agreed to the marriage. Abena stood beside her father, her face unreadable, dressed in a green kente wrapper that matched Kofi's work. The elders blessed the union with libations of palm wine poured into the earth, and Nana Yaw handed Adwoa the pouch, enough to pay the debts and buy food for months. The wedding was simple but loud, as Asankare weddings were. Women pounded yam, men drummed, and children danced around the fire. Kofi wore his best kente, a pattern of black and yellow called Sika Fre Mogya, money calls blood. Ironic, he thought. Abina moved stiffly, her city polish clashing with the village dust, but she spoke the vows in Twi. Her voice clipped. Kofi wondered if she hated him already. They moved into a small house Nana Yaw built near the river, its cement walls a step up from mud brick. Kofi set up his loom inside, weaving for Nana Yaw's orders, yards of kente shipped to Accra, then overseas. The money came, steady, and more than he'd ever seen. Enough to send Afia back to school and buy Akosua a tonic from the herbalist. But Abena was a stranger in his home. She complained about the heat, the flies, the lack of a fridge. She cooked reluctantly, her fufu lumpy, and snapped at Kofi when he worked late.
One evening, as Kofi wove under a lantern's flicker, Abena sat across from him, picking at a mango. "Why do you work so hard?" she asked, her tone sharp. "My father pays you enough. It's not just money," Kofi said, not looking up. "This cloth is my father's spirit, my family's story. It's who I am." She snorted. "It's cloth? You sound like an old man." He stopped, his hand still on the loom. "Then why did you agree to marry me?" She hesitated, then tossed the mango peel aside. "Because my father said I'd be a fool to refuse. He thinks you're honorable. I think you're stuck." Her words stung, but Kofi saw something flicker in her eyes. Restlessness, maybe fear. He went back to weaving, the silence thick between them. Weeks passed, tense and quiet. Then one morning, as Kofi returned from the river with water, he found Abena sitting at his loom, her fingers fumbling with the threads. A strip of kente lay half-finished, crooked but earnest. She flinched when she saw him. "What are you doing?" he asked, softer than he meant. "I wanted to try," she muttered. "You make it look easy." "It's not." Kofi sat beside her, adjusting the shuttle. "It takes time. My father taught me when I was Akosua's age. Here, like this." He guided her hands, showing her the rhythm. She followed, clumsy but focused, and for the first time they worked together without words. That night, over a pot of palm nut soup she'd cooked. Better than her last try, she spoke again. "In Kumasi, I had everything. School, friends, a phone. Then my mother died and my father decided I needed a husband to settle me. I didn't want this either, Kofi." He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just the spoiled girl, but a daughter grieving, uprooted. "We're both trapped then," he said. "Maybe," she replied, a small smile breaking through. "But the soup's not bad, is it?" He laughed, the sound surprising them both. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a thread. Thin, fragile, but there. Months later, the rains returned, soaking Asankare's fields and swelling the prow. Kofi and Abena wove together now, her hands steadier, her patterns bold. She had started teaching Akosua to read, and Efia called her sister without prompting. One day, as they walked to the market, Abina slipped her hand into his. It wasn't Sarwar's hand, but it was warm, real. Under the baobab, Kofi saw Sarwar selling ground nuts, her eyes catching his for a moment before she turned away. His chest ached, but he squeezed Abina's hand. Life wasn't the dream he'd woven as a boy, but it was his now, tangled, tough, and somehow beautiful.